Imagine a time when survival meant outsmarting your captors, when every move was a battle of wits, and every day could be your last. Now, picture a slave who turned the tables in the most incredible way, training wolves to hunt down the very people who held him in chains. It sounds like something out of legend, but it's a story that's deeply rooted in history. A story of defiance, cunning, and raw survival. Today, we dive into the mind of a slave who outwitted not only his masters, but the very nature of the system that sought to control him. Stick around, because you won't believe what happened next. If you're as captivated by this tale as we are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with friends who love history's hidden heroes. The sun beats down relentlessly as the whistle of the overseer cuts through the air, echoing across the field. The slaves work, survive, under a system designed to break them. But for some, survival isn't just about living through another day. It's about outwitting the system, playing a game no one thinks they can win. This was the world for our slave, a man whose name has been lost to history, but whose story resonates through the centuries. Imagine the harsh reality. Endless labor, a life where freedom is nothing but a distant dream, and the constant fear of punishment. For the enslaved, the odds were stacked against them, and rebellion seemed impossible. But there's a quiet power in the human spirit, a resilience that can't be crushed by chains. And it was that spirit that led this man to defy the odds. He wasn't the only one who dreamed of freedom, but he had something most didn't, an unshakable sense of strategy. You see, resistance wasn't always about fighting with fists. Sometimes it was about survival with a purpose. The masters, with their comfortable lives, underestimated the power of the enslaved. They never expected that a single man could challenge them so deeply, so cunningly. And yet, that's exactly what happened. This was a man who, despite the pain, the suffering, and the constant reminders of his oppression, never stopped thinking. Thinking about how he could turn the tide. Thinking about how he could use not just his mind, but the world around him, the animals, the landscape, the very forces of nature, to regain control. His plan was audacious, dangerous, and clever. But it was born from necessity. This wasn't just rebellion. This was survival at its most creative. You might be wondering, how did a man bound in chains, stripped of his rights and freedom, come to possess the skills needed to train wolves? It's a question that feels almost too fantastical to believe. But for our slave, it wasn't a question of how. It was a question of survival. Nature was his ally, and in the wilderness surrounding the plantation, he found a different kind of freedom, a kind that didn't need chains. This man wasn't just surviving, he was studying. He watched animals, understood their behavior, and learned how to communicate with them. Wolves, especially, intrigued him. Fierce, loyal, and wild. They embodied a freedom he could only dream of. But over time, he learned their ways, deciphering their body language, their calls, and their movements. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It took patience, determination, and an understanding of the world that many of his captors could never grasp. The wolves, while wild, weren't beyond reach. They had a code of their own, and once he understood it, he began forming a bond with them. At first, it was small things, feeding them scraps, learning their territory, gaining their trust. He wasn't trying to tame them. He was learning how to coexist, how to move with them, and how to turn their natural instincts into a weapon. This wasn't just about gaining the favor of the wolves. This was about turning them into allies. And in this unorthodox alliance, the slave saw a chance, perhaps the only chance, to turn the tide against his masters. What would it take to move from simply coexisting with these creatures to training them to hunt down his masters? The answer was coming, but the risk was enormous. There was no turning back now. The masters thought they had absolute control over the land, the slaves, and even the very rhythm of life on the plantation. They saw themselves as untouchable, their wealth built on the backs of the enslaved. But there's an old saying, the higher you are, the harder you fall. They were blind to the spark of rebellion growing in the heart of one of their own, a man they deemed as nothing more than property. They underestimated him, not just because he was a slave, but because they saw him as subhuman. To them, he was just another cog in the machine, a body that could work the fields, follow orders, and live in chains. They didn't believe he had the capacity for the kind of cleverness, the kind of planning that could threaten their entire way of life. He was just a tool to them, useful, but easily discarded. But what they didn't understand was the power of a mind pushed to its limits. This wasn't a man who simply accepted his fate. He spent his days working the fields, but his mind was always working in secret, plotting, learning, and observing. Every opportunity to exploit a weakness in the system was noted, every detail about the master's routines memorized. He knew them better than they knew themselves. It wasn't just about learning the landscape, it was about understanding the power dynamics that governed it. The masters never suspected that one of their own would outthink them. They believed that power came from ownership, from wealth, and from force. They didn't see that true power could come from something far more elusive, the ability to manipulate the very environment around them. And that, my friends, was exactly what he was planning to do. Imagine the kind of patience it takes to train a wolf. Not just to sit, not just to follow commands like a dog, but to use their raw instinct for something far more dangerous, a mission of vengeance. The slave's plan was as audacious as it was brilliant, and it began in the quietest of ways. Small gestures, simple steps, and an unspoken language between him and the wolves. It didn't start with aggression or force. He knew that the wolves weren't like the farm animals the masters kept. They were creatures of the wild, driven by instincts far more primal than obedience. But the slave had spent enough time with them to understand their minds, to know that loyalty could be earned. He began by feeding them regularly, but more importantly, he spent hours observing them, learning their behavior. He knew that in the wild, the wolf's loyalty was a bond formed through mutual respect. If he could give them something the masters never could, freedom, the wolves would come to see him as an ally, not an enemy. But this wasn't just about winning their trust. It was about using their skills, their natural hunting instincts. The slave began training them, not just to obey his voice, but to understand when to hunt, when to hide, and how to move without detection. It was a delicate process. One wrong move, one sign of weakness, and the wolves could turn on him. But the risks didn't matter. He was willing to risk it all. This was his only chance. In time, the wolves became a team, silent, deadly, and in tune with their trainer. The plan was in motion. The master's sense of control would soon be shattered by the very creatures they never thought would be anything more than beasts. And when that moment came, the wolves would be ready. The night was still, a quiet hum hanging in the air, as the slave led the wolves through the dense woods surrounding the plantation. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was time to see if everything he had worked for, the countless hours spent training, observing, and planning, would pay off. The first strike was always the hardest, the most dangerous. But there was no turning back now. The wolves moved with precision, their dark forms blending into the night. They were no longer just wild animals. They were soldiers in a battle for freedom. The slave had taught them well, how to approach without making a sound, how to scent the air and know exactly where their prey was. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making a statement. The masters would feel the power shift, and it would be irreversible. As they approached the master's house, the tension was palpable. The household was asleep, unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. The slave's heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the wolves would turn the tide. Without warning, the wolves attacked. The silence of the night was shattered by the growls and the sounds of pursuit. The masters, caught completely off guard, scrambled in panic. They had no idea what hit them. The wolves moved like shadows, swift and brutal, their sharp teeth sinking into the flesh of the unsuspecting masters. Inside the house, chaos erupted. Screams echoed through the walls as the masters tried to fend off the wolves. But they were no match for the speed and ferocity of the creatures. The power balance had shifted. The slave's plan had worked. His first strike had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. But as the wolves retreated into the night, their mission complete, the slave knew this was just the beginning. The masters would retaliate. They would come for him. But for now, he had won, and that taste of victory was sweeter than any freedom he had ever known. What makes a wolf so terrifying? It's not just their size or their teeth. It's their intelligence, their ability to work together as a pack, and their unrelenting pursuit of their target. Wolves are born hunters, driven by instincts honed over centuries. But what if those instincts could be channeled, guided, and directed for a purpose far beyond the wild? That's exactly what the slave had done. The wolves weren't just animals. They were his allies, his partners in this high-stakes game. He had carefully studied their behavior, learned how they moved, how they communicated. Over time, he became something of a wolf himself, understanding their silent signals, their body language, and the subtle ways they coordinated with one another. They became a unit, a lethal force that moved in perfect synchrony, as if they were extensions of his own will. When the first strike was launched, it wasn't just the slave's command that drove the wolves. It was their own natural instincts, refined and perfected by his guidance. They didn't need leashes or chains to control them. They were as free as the wind, and yet they listened to him. They trusted him. But the wolves weren't just ferocious predators. They were clever. They understood when to attack and when to pull back, when to be quiet and when to let their presence be known. In a world where the enslaved were meant to be subservient, the wolves flipped the script. They didn't follow orders from the masters. No, they followed the man who understood them, the man who saw them not as beasts to be controlled, but as allies to be respected. In a world where they were seen as nothing more than tools, the wolves had become instruments of revenge, nature's avengers ready to strike at the very heart of the oppressive system that sought to control both them and the slave. Now that the wolves had made their presence known, the game shifted. What had once been a simple act of retaliation had turned into something far more dangerous, an ongoing battle of strategy and survival. The masters, desperate to regain control, didn't just sit back and wait for the wolves to strike again. They retaliated with a force of their own, but they were playing catch-up, always a step behind. The slave knew this was far from over. The first strike had been a shock to the system, but now the masters were on high alert, more determined than ever to capture him. The entire plantation had been put on lockdown, with patrols circling the land at all hours of the day and night. Yet, the wolves and their master remained elusive, moving like shadows through the dense forests and tall grass. Every step, every move calculated. The hunter had become the hunted. But there was an undeniable power in the way the slave and his wolves moved. Every night became a game of cat and mouse. The masters searched for any trace, any sign that the wolves were near. The slave used their own tactics against them, leaving false trails, using the natural terrain to his advantage, and always staying one step ahead. It was a game of wits, and for the first time, the enslaved were the ones controlling the board. With every passing day, the tension grew. The wolves grew more skilled, more precise. The slave became more attuned to their movements, and together, they formed an almost unstoppable team. The masters, though, couldn't afford to lose. They weren't just fighting for control of the land. They were fighting for their very way of life. Who would win this deadly game? The odds seemed impossible, but the slave had something the masters never expected: the power of patience, the mastery of the wild, and a bond with the wolves that no man could break. As the days wore on, the balance of power began to shift, ever so subtly, until it became undeniable. The masters, once so confident in their control, now found themselves in the grip of fear. What had begun as a struggle between a slave and his masters had slowly morphed into a much larger battle, a battle for dominance, not just over the land, but over the very system that kept people like the slave in chains. The wild, once a symbol of chaos and danger, had become an ally, a force that the masters could no longer tame. The tipping point came during one fateful night, when the slave and his wolves, moving with the precision they had honed over weeks of practice, managed to infiltrate the heart of the master's estate. For the first time, the slaves were no longer the hunted. They had become the hunters. The wolves' howls echoed through the night, a sound of liberation and of terror for the masters. Inside the house, the masters scrambled, but they were outmatched. Panic set in as they realized the very system they had relied upon for their power was crumbling. They couldn't stop the wolves. They couldn't stop the slave. And they certainly couldn't stop the fear that had taken root in their hearts. In that moment, everything changed. The slave's plan had not only succeeded, it had reversed the roles. The masters were no longer in control of the plantation. The slave, with his wolves by his side, had turned the tide. For the first time, the enslaved had the upper hand, and the masters were at their mercy. The power dynamics that had been so rigid, so unyielding, were now in question. Who was truly in control now? The wolves had hunted the masters, and the slave had orchestrated it all. This was the moment when history shifted, when the impossible became possible, and the roles of master and slave were flipped on their head. The aftermath of the slave's bold strike was nothing short of chaotic. The plantation, once a symbol of the master's unchallenged authority, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. The wolves had done their work, and the masters, reeling from the shock of the attack, knew they had to respond, fiercely and decisively. But in their fury, they underestimated one critical factor. The slave had already outsmarted them once. In the days that followed, the plantation was swept by a storm of retribution. The masters called in reinforcements, more guards, more dogs, more patrols. The hunt for the slave and his wolves intensified. They were no longer just looking to quell rebellion. They were hunting for blood. For the slaves who had been witnesses to the attack, there was an air of fear mixed with awe. The masters had always ruled through terror, but now that terror was directed inward. The power they once held over their enslaved workers seemed fragile, exposed. And while the enslaved could feel a small spark of hope, they also knew the price of rebellion. The masters would strike back with everything they had. No one could afford to be seen as sympathetic to the slave's cause. As the days turned into weeks, the plantation descended into a tense, deadly cat-and-mouse game. The masters were determined to punish those who dared to defy them. In their eyes, this was no longer just about controlling property. It was about maintaining their dominance. And they would stop at nothing to make sure that no one else dared to even think about following in the slave's footsteps. But even as the noose tightened, even as the retaliation escalated, one thing remained clear. The master's power was no longer absolute. They had been shaken to their core. And that, in itself, was a victory. The world had been irrevocably changed. The balance of power had been broken, if only for a brief moment. The aftermath of the slave's bold strike was nothing short of chaotic. The plantation, once a symbol of the master's unchallenged authority, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. The wolves had done their work, and the masters, reeling from the shock of the attack, knew they had to respond, fiercely and decisively. But in their fury, they underestimated one critical factor. The slave had already outsmarted them once. In the days that followed, the plantation was swept by a storm of retribution. The masters called in reinforcements, more guards, more dogs, more patrols. The hunt for the slave and his wolves intensified. They were no longer just looking to quell rebellion. They were hunting for blood. For the slaves who had been witnesses to the attack, there was an air of fear mixed with awe. The masters had always ruled through terror, but now that terror was directed inward. The power they once held over their enslaved workers seemed fragile, exposed. And while the enslaved could feel a small spark of hope, they also knew the price of rebellion. The masters would strike back with everything they had. No one could afford to be seen as sympathetic to the slave's cause. As the days turned into weeks, the plantation descended into a tense, deadly cat-and-mouse game. The masters were determined to punish those who dared to defy them. In their eyes, this was no longer just about controlling property. It was about maintaining their dominance. And they would stop at nothing to make sure that no one else dared to even think about following in the slave's footsteps. But even as the noose tightened, Even as the retaliation escalated, one thing remained clear. The master's power was no longer absolute. They had been shaken to their core. And that, in itself, was a victory. The world had been irrevocably changed. The balance of power had been broken, if only for a brief moment.